This Memorial Day, I want to share a story about my great uncle, who was in the Navy during World War II. When his term of service was over, he re-enlisted and was stationed on the USS Peary, a destroyer in the Pacific Theater, as a gunner. The Navy provided steady pay and 3 hots and a cot. But during the Japanese attack on Darwin Harbor, the Peary was destroyed and he was lost at sea. The USS Peary, hull DD-226, was a Clemson-class destroyer of the United States Navy. She was commissioned in 1920 and sunk by Japanese aircraft at Darwin, Northern Territory, Australia, on 19 February 1942. The Peary was laid down by William Cramp and Sons of Philadelphia on 9 September 1919. The destroyer was launched on 6 April 1920, sponsored by Mrs. Edward Stafford, daughter of Admiral Peary. The vessel was commissioned on 22 October 1920. The Peary served in the Far East from 1922 onward with the Yangtze River Patrol from 1923 to 1931. Until World War II, she participated in the Asiatic Fleet's annual deployments to Chinese waters as pre-war flagship of Destroyer Division 59. The Peary survived the first month of the war by brilliant seamanship in the retreat from the Philippines, only to turn desperately unlucky in her sinking 6 weeks later, but thus became a leading symbol of Australian-American ties. The Peary was moored at Cavite, Philippines, when news of the Pearl Harbor raid reached her, and was caught in the raid on the Cavite Naval Yard, Philippines, 2 days later. On the early afternoon of 10 December, more than 50 two-engined high-level bombers appeared over Cavite and, cruising leisurely above the range of anti-aircraft fire, destroyed practically the entire base. The Peary was tied up at a small pier and took one bomb forward, which damaged the superstructure and stack. It killed 8 of her crew and wounded many more, including her commanding officer, Harry H. Keith, who was hit in the knees. She found herself in a precarious position as fires began to set off torpedo warheads in a torpedo overhaul shop on the wharf next to her. The USS Whippoorwill towed her out. Whippoorwill and USS Pillsbury came alongside, and their fire hoses extinguished the fire in 5 minutes. The wounded commanding officer, Commander H. Keith, was relieved by Commander J. M. Birmingham, and repairs needed to make her seaworthy, if not battle-worthy, were made. On Christmas Day, Admiral Hart learned that General MacArthur had declared Manila an open city, making Cavite untenable. Refueling at Sangley Point there, Pillsbury and Peary watched facilities being blown up as rumor spread that the 2 destroyers were to be scuttled. Off Corregidor, 26 December, they were again attacked by air. Peary by 15 high-altitude bombers in 2 groups. Maneuvering to evade, she was not hit, but near misses did minor damage. Then, Admiral Rockwell finally granted permission to put to sea by the best route to join Task Force 5, then concentrating at Surabaya, Java, while Pillsbury took departure via an outside route for Balikpapan. Peary followed in the evening via an inside route south. By the morning of December 27, Peary was in Campomanes Bay, Negros Island, where she decided to put in for the day. Her crew camouflaged her with green paint and palm fronds, hoping to elude Japanese patrol bombers. 5 passed overhead without spotting the ship that morning, and when darkness fell, she set out through the Celebes Sea for Makassar Strait. A Japanese bomber spotted Peary the next morning and shadowed her until early afternoon, when 3 other bombers joined her in a 2-hour attack. The planes dropped 500-pound bombs and then launched 2 torpedoes only 500 yards from the ship. Peary quickly backed on one engine, and both torpedoes narrowly missed the bow. Seconds later, 2 more missed the stern. As Peary put on speed to evade, its bomb fell 100 yards in her wake, and she emerged with only strafing damage to her stacks. The bombers then withdrew. Unknown to Peary, an Australian PBY, a scouting aircraft from Ambon, had also sighted a Japanese aircraft escort, and as a result misidentified the Peary as Japanese also. Making landfall at Manado at 1645, it appeared the approach of darkness made it unnecessary to take shelter there. Instead, after inquiring by blinker whether Bangka Strait was mined, but receiving no answer, the Peary turned northeast into the passage inside Bunakang Island. There, off Kina, at 1800, 3 Australian Lockheed Hudson bombers appeared. Withholding their fire, the crew cheered at the sight of them until they commenced 2 bombing runs each. More accurate than the Japanese, their near misses killed 1 man by friendly fire, the phrase coined in Peary's decalogue. 2 more were wounded as shrapnel peppered the ship, perforating the hull shell plating in several places, including the steering compartment and parting the wheel ropes. A 4th man was blown overboard by Peary's own after 4-inch gun as the ship heeled in a sharp turn. He was rescued by a fishing boat and spent the war working in coal mines in Japan. Steering by hand, Peary resumed her course through Bangka Strait and then stood out to the south. By 8 o'clock that night, however, the starboard engine's thrust bearing was found to be overheating, and an examination revealed that the bearing had been wiped. As fuel was known to be low, and an acute shortage of boiler feed water was also discovered. It was hoped these could be found at Dutch-held Ternate, colonial capital of the Halmahera region. Accordingly, after examining charts for a suitably deep shoreline, surrounded by high land where she could be concealed, Peary sent a dispatch and shaped a new course east across the Malacca Sea, making 22 knots on her port engine. It was after midnight, with the navigator and the captain steering from the afterdeck house when she entered the narrow channel between Ternate's island neighbor, Tidore, and tiny Metara. At 0500 on the 29th, she tied up to palm trees on Metara's northeast side, facing Ternate. There, so effectively camouflaged that friendly PBYs did not at first see her, she found fuel and took on water and stores as her engineers worked on the thrust bearing. Underway once more for Ambon at 1830 on the 30th, Peary's starboard thrust bearing again failed en route. But at 1430 on the 31st, she made Ambon Bay. Refueling overnight as the Australians apologized for attacking her, she took departure shortly after 10 a.m. on New Year's Day, 1942, under the escort of now friendly aircraft. Without charts of Australia, she anchored in Clarence Strait off Darwin at 1600 on the 2nd, then followed Parrot through the minefields to Port Darwin and anchored there at 8:40 on January 3rd, with her crew hoping that their next destination would be the West Coast. The new year found Peary at Darwin, Australia. Meanwhile, it became apparent many of Peary's crew had contracted what was later diagnosed as malignant malaria at Ternate. 28 crew members were stricken, of whom 8 eventually died. On January 6th, the day Lieutenant Birmingham was promoted to Lieutenant Commander, the Japanese launched their first air attacks on Ambon. On the 30th, they commenced landing operations, and on February 3rd, the remaining Australian garrison surrendered. On February 15th to the 16th, the Peary took part in a mission to transport reinforcements and supplies to Allied forces in Dutch Timor, which culminated in the Battle of Timor on February 20th, 1942. Japanese forces invaded the island and were resisted by a small, under-equipped force of Allied military personnel known as Sparrow Force, predominantly from Australia, United Kingdom, and the Netherlands East Indies. Following a brief but stout resistance, the Japanese succeeded in forcing the surrender of the bulk of the Allied force after 3 days of fighting, although several hundred Australian commandos continued to wage an unconventional raiding campaign. They were resupplied by aircraft and vessels based mostly in Darwin, Australia, about 400 miles to the southeast, across the Timor Sea. During the subsequent fighting, the Japanese suffered heavy casualties, but they were eventually able to contain the Australians, and 40,000 to 70,000 Timorese civilians died as a result of the Japanese occupation, which lasted until the end of the war. However, an entire Japanese division was tied up on Timor for more than 6 months, preventing it from being used in the earlier phases of the New Guinea campaign, while at the same time inflicting a disproportionate level of casualties on them. On February 15th, the Peary and the Houston stood out as escorts for another convoy to Timor. Sighted, the convoy was attacked the following morning by 36 land-based bombers and 10 seaplanes, followed by reports that a carrier task force was also operating in strike range. As a result of these intense air attacks, the Peary had to abandon these missions. Ordered to join Admiral Dorman's force, soon to be engaged in the Battle of the Java Sea, Houston and Peary immediately refueled. As they stood out of Port Darwin that evening, Peary picked up a submarine contact. A long search ended without result, but consumed vital fuel. While Houston continued westward alone to fight in the Battle of the Java Sea and be sunk in Sunda Strait on March 1st, the Peary was ordered back to Darwin again to top off. She stood in and anchored at 0100 on February 19th. On February 19th, 1942, Darwin experienced a massive Japanese air attack. Just before 10 o'clock that morning, the first of 188 bombers from carriers Akagi, Kaga, Hiru, and Soryu, plus 54 land-based bombers from Ambon, began attacking the port. In combination, they sank 8 ships and demolished the port. The Peary was the first ship in Darwin Harbor to be singled out by the dive bombers and was not in readiness for an attack. The UK merchant tanker British Motorist was refueling the USS Peary at the time of the attack, and she was unable to slip her anchor quickly and barely got underway. Japanese dive bombers scored 5 direct hits. The first bomb exploded on the fantail. The second, an incendiary on the galley deck house. The third did not explode. The fourth hit forward and set off the forward ammunition magazines. The fifth, another incendiary, exploded in the after engine room. Even as she was sinking, a .30 caliber machine gun on the after deck house and a .50 caliber machine gun on the galley deck house continued firing until the last enemy plane departed. The last unknown gunner, firing even while the water rose, still at the gun controls, loading, aiming, and firing, unaided, when the Peary went down, stern first, at about 1300. Now, I have no way of knowing if this gunner was my uncle, but I can tell you the determination and the stubborn unwillingness to give up, even in defeat, would have been in keeping with my family's proud Scandinavian heritage. He would have been a welcome guest at many a Thanksgiving and Christmas dinner. Here you have a picture, sinking by the stern, the USS Peary DD-226, still firing her forward gun. To the left, the tanker, British Motorist, is on fire and also sinking during the Japanese air raid on Darwin, Australia. 89 officers and men, including Lieutenant Commander Birmingham, were killed in her sinking. 57 survived, 20 of whom were wounded. The Peary was struck from the Navy list May 8, 1942, and received 1 battle star for World War II service. Captain Birmingham was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross. There is a memorial in Darwin in honor of the lives lost. This memorial in Bicentennial Park consists of a plaque and one of the 4-inch deck guns recovered from the Peary in the 1950s by diver Carl Atkinson. This gun is aimed towards the Peary's resting place in the harbor. In the words of Peter Gross, author of An Awkward Truth, The Bombing of Darwin, February 1942. The doomed yet magnificent reply by the destroyer USS Peary in Darwin Harbor as Japanese dive bombers swarmed around her deserves a place in the legend books of American military history. In 2001, a memorial service was conducted and a plaque dedicated on the 50th anniversary of the Anzac Treaty, pointing toward the Peary's final position. The gun today is an icon of enduring ties between Australia and the United States that date back from the events surrounding her loss. The Peary lies in 89 feet of water in Darwin Harbor. The wreck itself is a memorial to those who lost their lives in the first bombing raid on Australian soil and to those who defended Darwin.